Bonjour. Merci d'être venu à cette conférence. On va tout de suite avoir en ligne Madame Weissenfeld. Vous savez que la conférence se passera en anglais. Et je serai là à côté au cas où il y a des questions à la fin. Je peux aussi les traduire pour vous si vous voulez. Hello. I can't see you. Perhaps I'll just turn
Bonjour.
I'll just turn my chair so I can see you. So thank you so much for being with us. It's a pleasure. We would have loved to have you in person, but I think it's wonderful that you immediately accepted to give your talk online. And it's a very important subject, I think, that we will be discussing today. Yesterday, I don't know whether some of you were present when Slilia Zernik talked about contemporary art after the disaster of Fukuyama. There is this sense of disaster and catastrophe that we associate with Japan, perhaps in a simplifying way. And I think what we will hear from Dr. Weissenfeld is something that is much more based on research, on lots of thinking about what it means, cultural life in Japan. She is a great specialist of Japan in the modern period, so early 20th century, with a major book, Imagining Disaster, Tokyo and the Visual Culture of Japan's Great Earthquake of 1923, which appeared at Berkeley University of California Press in 2012. And a book before that she has written, Mavu, Japanese Artist and the Avant-Garde, 1905-1913, which appeared also at the University of California Press in 2002. And I found a quotation, a review of your book by Michael Luquen, who is with us today, tomorrow, who is one of the great specialists on Japan's cultural and intellectual life. And he really insisted the importance of the source work and the archival work that you've been doing, and that really, I think, gets us away from certain cliches and stereotypical thinking. So I think what we will hear today is a situation in history. The way we will proceed is that we will listen to you for about half an hour, and then there will be 5 to 10 minutes of time for questions from the audience. So thank you again, and please, you can talk now. So I'm not sure, you probably don't see, does she see the people in the audience? No. Should I turn my computer? Ah, okay. So we have a full room.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm so delighted to be with you in any capacity, but of course, I would much rather have been there in person. It looks like it's an incredible venue. And also thank you to Michael Luquen for kindly including me in this. I greatly respect his work as well, and all of my colleagues and scholars in France who work on Japan. I'm going to share my screen right now. Please tell me if anything is not working. Okay. So, as the kind introduction said, I'm going to be talking a bit about art and disaster in Japan. And as you know, this is something that I've been working on for many years, and continues to interest me because it's a perennially relevant topic. But on September 1st, 1923, as many of you know, a 7.9 magnitude earthquake hit Tokyo, and together with the ensuing fires, destroyed nearly half of the city, killing over 100,000 people. And just to give you a sense of the scale of this seismogram shows that massive first shock and the thousands of subsequent aftershocks. The earthquake similarly decimated the major commercial port city of Yokohama in nearby Kanagawa Prefecture, large portions of 5 other surrounding prefectures, causing devastating fires, and tsunami waves. And it was soon dubbed the Great Kanto earthquake to indicate that it was not simply a Tokyo earthquake, but had really devastated the entire Kanto region. And until March 11th, 2011, the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake was unparalleled in Japan's history in its seismic scale and extent of damage. In fact, it was the world's worst national disaster of the early 20th century. And in terms of loss of life and material damage, it is still Japan's worst national disaster in terms of all metrics, except seismic. But when the unprecedented 9.0 magnitude earthquake of 2011 hit off the coast of Tohoku, the northeastern region of Japan, followed by hundreds of strong aftershocks, people throughout the world were again reminded of modern humanity's fragility in the face of nature. And not only did the quake produce another massive tsunami that washed away the coastline like it had in 1923, but also, like its predecessor, it generated a torrent of images that saturated the visual field. At the time, I had just submitted the manuscript for my book for imaging disaster on the 1923 catastrophe and was very much deep into thinking about the ways in which visual images mediate our vision and understanding of disasters. And this new event sadly offered fascinating and very disturbing echoes of the earlier earthquake. I had only to view a sampling of the work of contemporary photojournalists to see the recurrence of much iconic imagery from previous catastrophes. For instance, the symbolic use of dramatically spiked seismograms to emphasize extraordinary magnitude, or the spectacular scenes of destruction, one after another after another. Powerful aerial vistas of widespread devastation, so that this was not just an individual experience, but a civilizational, almost planetary in terms of its devastation. And of course, many images of the earth violently fractured. There were scenes of grieving and contemplative figures in a sea of ruins. And very interestingly, a host of wounded objects and venerable debris, the venerable debris of daily life that stood in for wounded and missing bodies. We still had rows of anonymous bodies, which were also displayed, but curiously enough, now with the more sanitized and stringent press taboos, they were covered, not actually revealed as corpses. And there were the heartbreaking, beseeching message boards in search of missing loved ones. This compelling visual lexicon of disaster is enduring and undeniable. But the question is, how do these thousands of graphic representations of death and destruction and images of ruined landscapes act on us to evoke emotions or to provoke action? The producers of the images, consciously or unconsciously, stake a claim to a particular meaning for disasters, and they communicate this meaning to us through both form and content. And my study of the visual responses in 1923 suggests that disasters provide opportunities. They say never waste a good crisis, and I think that's absolutely true. They are opportunities for individuals, societies, and nations to articulate their diverse agendas, and I emphasize diverse agendas, for urban, social, political, or even moral reform. And after a disaster, everyone is a critic, even when that criticism is couched in the collectivist rhetoric of national resilience. There were striking similarities between criticisms in 1923 and 2011, with accusations of political ineptitude and malfeasance, and comments about the moral turpitude of modern society or the pitfalls of technological hubris. These criticisms reveal powerful parallels between the past and the present. Despite claims of a shared national trauma, when disaster strikes, inequitable social structures and economic development policies expose certain members of the community and the populace to greater risk and greater suffering than others. And like the unfortunate victims of the 1923 quake, who you see here in the devastated landscape, who were disproportionately from the poor neighborhoods of Tokyo's Low City or the Shitamachi, the Tohoku residents suffered more because of historical class and regional inequities. In 1923, the fundamental power of the Japanese nation state ultimately defined the quake experience as a national triumph, against adversity that produced the gleaming new Tokyo metropolis. And we see here in this painting moving from the darkness to the light as a kind of metaphor for that possibility of a new metropolis being rebuilt. But even after a decade has passed from the 2011 disaster, and we've just marked the 10th year anniversary, so this is a very poignant moment to think about this, the 3/11 disaster is still unfolding. So we do not yet know what the master narrative of that event will be. And I'm wondering if we will ever have a master narrative in the same way we did in 23. But particularly with the added horrific element of nuclear radiation contamination, and whether it's just unclear whether the Japanese state itself will ever be strong enough, again, to completely direct this narrative the way it did earlier in the century. But it's already clear that in the national and international mass media, the nuclear disaster story has superseded the national one, reinforcing scholars' common assertions about disaster, which is whatever their triggering event, natural or human, they all have aspects that are man-made. So today in this brief presentation, I'd like to offer you some thoughts about how we might think about disaster through images. As I mentioned, I'm interested in how visual culture, very broadly construed, mediates our experiences and understanding of disaster, how the historical production of images of disaster over time has distilled and codified certain thematic tropes that form a recognizable visual lexicon of catastrophe, and how this is both culturally specific and particular in some ways and universal in others. And Japan's just a perfect case study for analyzing the imaging of disaster, because as an archipelago off the coast of Asia that was actually formed by the intersection of two major seismic faults, it experiences very high volumes of natural disasters, whether it's earthquakes and tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, you name it. There is an intense and long-standing history of disaster. Disaster has literally been a generative force in Japanese culture as far back as recorded history. And as disaster is unquestionably a defining feature of Japan's cultural landscape, the general belief system has integrated the cyclicality of destruction and renewal. And so one of the premises of my study is that disaster is both destructive and constructive. It brings physical devastation and psychological trauma, without a doubt, but it also creates spaces for reflection and renewal. And that's not only my own interpretation, but actually the way earthquakes have traditionally been perceived in Japan as transformative, numinous events that augur significant, often necessary change. So before I jump into the 20th century, I would like to make a brief foray a little earlier in time, lest we think that this creative history of artistic responses to disaster doesn't extend back as well as forward. I'm going to take you to 1855 and the Ansei Edo quake that destroyed Tokyo's predecessor, the shogunal capital of Edo. Within 1 month after the quake, and this was a mammoth quake, single-sheet allegorical woodblock prints featuring catfish started to appear in the popular press in great numbers. These catfish prints were called namazu-e. Namazu is the word for catfish. And they quickly became subject to regulation and censorship, but their popularity ensured their continued production illegally. And as far as we know, in total, over 400 varieties of catfish prints were printed and are known today. Catfish, you might wonder, why catfish? Catfish had come to be associated with earthquakes through a long cosmological tradition and their actual tendency, physically, to forecast the coming of seismic events with strange behavior, because the fish themselves swim close to the ground and they sense the tremors and they start to get a little strange. Throughout the period, it was commonly believed that at moments of moral or social crisis, particularly when there was a perceived need for spiritual reconstruction, or in Japanese, seishin fuko, the catfish would get loose, causing earthquake tremors by shaking the country on its back. And this destructive catfish was both deliverer of moral reckoning and facilitator of world renewal, or world rectification, as it was called. Thus, the Ansei catfish prints represent earthquakes as having restorative effects as well as destructive repercussions. And this is really important to think about this dialectic of destruction and construction, of moral and divine punishment in a sense, and moral rectitude, renewal, and rectification. Thus, the Ansei catfish quakes represented earthquakes as having not only restorative effects and destructive repercussions, But the since entier catfish prints have been studied a lot, I'm not going to go over them in great detail here, but I do think that one of the things that I'd like to point out that does relate to the continuities and ruptures of later visual production is the importance of visual satire. And we don't always associate satire with disaster, but there was quite a lot of visual satire, and it ties into the idea of criticism that I mentioned earlier. Issues of class equity and social abuse are also particularly addressed in a number of prints from the catfish, explicitly talking about this concept of divine punishment, tenbatsu or tenken, particularly punishing the rich or ruling class for their moral lapses, materialistic excesses, and inept leadership. And along with the sophisticated multi-layered wordplay that was common throughout Japanese print culture at this time period, particularly in ukiyo-e, the images of the floating world, of the pleasure quarters, there was a tinge of parody and comedic veneer that was imparted to these moral matters of earthquake representations. And that's something I'd just like you to keep in the back of your mind, because it is something that we will see again in 1923. Parody was a powerful form of veiled social critique in Japan, especially at a time when public criticism was strictly forbidden, which is why they were censored, but still distributed. And I'm just showing you two examples of catfish prints from this time period. They're so interesting, and I highly recommend looking at them and the great scholarship that's been done on them. This catfish print that you see here is, again, satirical, and you see the god Ebisu sitting here. He's one of the gods of good fortune, and he's taken over watch for the Kashima deity, who's here on the right, who went away for a conference with the other gods at Izumo. And he's left Ebisu to watch the protective keystone that is supposedly on the head of the catfish, but he falls asleep. And when he falls asleep, the catfish is loose. And you see the catfish up on the top here getting loose and wreaking destruction upon Edo. It has fire on its head, and the city is rent asunder. And you see Kashima racing back on the right, trying to get back, but it's just too late to protect the city. We see all different kinds of coins and various things, gold and silver coins shaken loose from the city at the bottom, indicting the wealthy elites and heralding a redistribution of wealth, which was a theme that was quite common. And this red squatting figure that you see here on the left was in the middle was the thunder god. And the thunder deity, he represents this thunderous sound of the earthquake. He's actually excreting drums. So you see a slightly scatological theme here as well. And the sound of the drums is indicative of that thunderous sound of earthquakes, which was considered one of its most fearful aspects here. It's also humorous because it refers to a popular Edo period pastime of competitive farting. So you see this mixture of humor and satire and political critique. It's decidedly quasi-comic, it's definitely scatological in tenor. The image reminds us that even gods fall down on the job, and therefore human beings must be ever more vigilant. And catfish were also anthropomorphized. Through this anthropomorphization of the catfish and the personification of earthquakes, the namazu-e, the catfish prints, are able to represent human types and disasters from all angles as destroyers, renovators, enemies, and heroes. And these catfish are a mirror of human society in all its ambiguity. And as such, they epistemologically transpose earthquake disasters into something understandable within that social context. We see a lot of images where anger and revenge against the destructive catfish were commonly thematized. Yet there's also a lot of whimsical images, such as this example here, where the catfish and his cohort, his friends and his colleagues, engage in endearing human activities. And this print shows the catfish, who's in his summer yukata here, playing the earthquake game with the gods of thunder, who's on the left, and the god of fire on the right. And they're often paired together. the catfish with the god of thunder and the god of fire. And the humor in this image pivots on two particular elements: the comical representation of these fantastic characters playing this well-known children's game. It was called Kitsune Ken, Fox Fists, and it's a little bit like Junken. It's a little like rock, paper, scissors. But it also pivots on the allegorical pictorialization of a common Japanese aphorism, which was about the four most fearful things: earthquake, thunder, fire, and father. The Japanese patriarch was considered the fourth most fearful thing. So the print shows the catfish, the earthquake, playing with the red thunder god and the fire god, whose back is turned to the viewer as the stern father looks on from behind. And the Namazu-e demonstrate the centrality of visual satire in responses to disaster. So to return to 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake was an unprecedented national catastrophe played out in the national and international theater of the mass media. And the visualization of the disaster was a major mediating aspect of the understanding of the event as a historical event over time. Images played a central role in constructing the earthquake as a national event that demanded solidarity from the entire country, and even importantly, empathy from the world. And you can see these relief stamps that were issued, particularly among Japanese American communities, to try to raise money for Japanese support. And around the world, the Red Cross was very important for that. The imaging of disaster provided visible evidence that erected a framework of visual authority to legitimate state action in responding to this national catastrophe. Yet the disaster was not the sole preserve of the state. As much as it would like to have claimed that it was. A range of public and private entities sought to use the opportunity of the disaster as a means of implementing their own visions for the future. So despite their documentary value, disaster images cannot simply be read as transparent representations, nor are they sinister simulacra attempting to stand in for some kind of elusive notion of reality. Rather, I think we have to consider the visual production as constituting a component of the historical event itself, embodying specific social interests. And as a mediating force, visual imagery channeled these social interests into cultural agency that formed contending public visions of the disaster experience. So just to reiterate this, it's an important point. There was no singular or all-encompassing experience of the disaster. It was as diverse as the people who experienced it. The state had one view, individual communities had other views, and they contended in the public sphere. Major disasters focus the social energy of diverse media on one critical event. In 1923, viewers read the documentary work of photography and film and the visualizations of scientific information like the seismogram that I showed you in tandem with hand-rendered images, experiencing a public visual sphere where the objective and the subjective were inextricably fused. So there's no strict objective lens to this. Everything is mixed together and seen in this kind of interoptic way. Each medium brought a distinct yet critical inflection. And when I say visual culture, I mean images and objects of all types, high and low, singular and reproducible, as well as the built environment. When I did my study, I intentionally expanded to range from popular culture and mass media to the fine arts. And I'm just going to show you a selection of some of those images, and you can see their great variety and how their medial qualities differ. So you might have lithographs, colorful lithographs like you see here, which were issued in series, or woodblock prints like this, also issued in many series of the ruins. You could have artist sketches as they walk through and try to memorialize and remember their experiences. More expressionistic types of drawings dealing with the somatic and emotional experience of the disaster. Ink paintings drawn and creating this shimmering and disturbing image of bodies floating down the river. Public sculpture used to memorialize the death of thousands of children, for instance. And of course, documentary and news photography, very important. I work a lot on the history of photography, and the varieties of photographic images and filmic images was quite staggering. And this included stereoscopic photographs for 3D viewing, images of these monumental ruined structures. It included thousands and thousands of commemorative postcards, black and white, and many tinted with color. Certainly films, as I mentioned, there were at least 12 to 15 films produced, and some of them were in a more montage idiom, like you see here. They were very important both for documentary and as experimental imagery of how the somatic experience of the earthquake affected the visual. Representations of the built environment were also very prevalent and very important, particularly as you had temporary refugee barracks like these around the imperial capital. This is an oil painting that's actually now exhibited in the memorial to the earthquake. And just this experience of this temporary built environment where people lived as the city was regenerating. And interestingly, this is where my two previous projects actually combine. Mavo and the avant-garde artists were also very engaged with these barracks, these temporary barrack structures, and they made these creative interventions into the reconstructed landscape and decorated the barracks temporarily. And we see a whole variety of those. And one thing I found was that the catfish returned. The catfish reemerged in cartoons and caricatures and other forms of visual satire to once again critique disaster. But by the 1920s, the critique had shifted to encompass new social changes, and a number of critics were specifically linking this catastrophe with the social liberation of women. They saw earthquakes as punishment for the bad tendencies of vanity, ostentation, and materialism among young women. And you might remember this is the period of the modern girl and the new woman, and women are moving more into the workforce. It's tremendous changes, social changes that are disrupting the social fabric in many ways. And so many linked their condemnation back to a kind of traditional cosmology where men were associated with the positive geomantic entity of the sky, and women were associated with the negative geomantic entity of the land. And thus, in the human realm, the shaking of the earthquake was connected to women, specifically to their unrest and restlessness. So the more restless women became in their social lives, the more tendency there was for the elements to be rent asunder and to bring on disasters. And this is an example from Kitazawa Rakuten, one of the premier social satirists who did many cover images for Jiji manga, images of current affairs from the 14th of October. So very soon after the earthquake hit. And it echoed this denunciation of women. It ran under the caption, "Vices Rectified by the Earthquake." And it features an imposing figure of an irate catfish man ripping off the jacket of a startled woman. And inside the lining of her jacket, you can see right here, is a four-character expression. It says vanity and ostentation. And so with his other hand, the catfish thrusts a more subdued garment into her other hand and says, which reads, "Substance and moral and physical fortitude." So he's offering her this subdued garment with its moral message on it. And even 2 years after the quake, Rakuten was invoking the retributive catfish. Reconstruction of the capital took many years, and the process itself became a target of intense criticism. It wasn't really until 1930 and 31 that the reconstruction was deemed complete. And visual satire used the specter of the catfish's return to rectify the corrupt and seemingly stymied process of reconstruction. So this is the second anniversary after the quake, and things are still moving along slowly. Rakuten's catfish looms large here, warning unscrupulous profiteers, idle public officials, immoral elites of the consequences of their profligate behavior. And he exclaims, "Shall I shake the ground one more time to really wake them up?" Because people have just kind of gone back to their bad behavior. And the caption below reads, "Look at the reality of the second anniversary of the earthquake. The land readjustment has not been completed yet. reconstruction materials are depleted and there's no building. The government does not know how to use its damage or donation funds. Women are dancing on the erupted volcano with their Western dress and short hair. And the text is referring to this modern couple here who seem to be blithely unaware of this destruction or just dancing along. And the parasol the woman is holding reads frivolous. So they're just dancing in the ruins, and politicians are stuffing their pockets with money, and government officials and land readjustment. This guy is asleep at his desk. Everything you can see is nothing is happening, and the catfish may come back to again be offer divine punishment. And one of the things that during disasters, you see this really creative commingling of high and low, and the aesthetics of all these different spheres influence one another. It is certainly clear that aesthetics and the photographic eye directly affected perception, even with ostensibly photodocumentary images. And that's something I write about extensively in my book. And I think it's really important. We do take photography as a kind of truth value, but these images show us very clearly how motivated, bracketed, constructed the images are, and the kind of narrative that they produce. They express scale and magnitude. They maximize the visual impact of the expansive devastation. They speak, as I said before, from the 2011 images about civilization and urbanistic destruction, and less about individual lives lost. And they do refer to the kind of new heights of aerial photography enabled by technology, which depersonalizes the connection between the viewer and the devastation. There's a lot of technological mediation between the images due to the camera and, of course, the airplane, the aircraft. And aerial photography was also a very important technology of reconnaissance during disasters and during war. And as people like Virilio have talked about, the camera in an airplane was a kind of watching machine, and it was used for various kinds of reconnaissance, also for search and rescue, relief operations. It is a tool and a kind of watching machine. And the photographic eye can forge identification between the viewer and the depicted subjects by bringing the experience down to human scale. So it can go up to aerial scale and it can come down to human scale, creating a lonely, pathos-filled stroll through the Ginza. And anyone who's been to Tokyo, this is not the image of Ginza that you would normally have. The aesthetics and the photographic eye also impute affect and temporality. They magnify first the terror, these kind of terrifying power of the earth is magnified through these rendering of fissures, which extend through at your feet. And so the angle creates this power of the earth. And the aesthetics of the photographic eye impute another kind of affect and temporality into images, particularly this image that I find so engaging, of the Yokohama station with a conductor standing here under a clock, which has stopped at exactly 11:58 a.m., the precise time that the earthquake first hit. People spoke about the time as having stopped, that the shock of the earthquake stopped time. And the clock kind of serves as a metonym for this traumatic disruption that the quake causes, and a recapitulation of photography's own interruption of the flow of time. There's no doubt that the trauma of disaster is never static, but we do get static images that make us aware of this kind of temporality and particular moments. And when I'm studying this, and writing about this, I try to expose that temporality about what those moments mean and what the flow of time is. It's very important when we're looking at disaster images, to elucidate the complex forms of ethical and unethical looking. Practice these embodied images of disaster they're both aesthetic and political, and there are conflicting images of any kind of community here. This might resonate with you with that earlier message board that we saw in 2011. This is a woodblock print on the left by Kiriya Senrin of the famous and still standing Saigo Takamori statue, the bronze statue in Ueno Park, with the posted names of missing loved ones. And on the right, we have an image by Miyatake Gaikotsu showing the same statue, but with a much more critical lens. It almost appears to be, the statue almost appears to be swallowed up by grief. And so we can have two images, one of kind of national triumph and resilience, people trying to find their families, and one of this kind of being swallowed up by the devastation. And refugees themselves were portrayed as innocent and altruistic victims, mothers and children. They could also be portrayed as murderous vigilantes. And many of these citizen vigilantes who were temporary keepers of the peace also were murderers and killed over 6,000 resident Korean colonial subjects and prominent leftist leaders during this time. And we must never forget that the ethics extends to looking as well, that when you're looking at corpses, such as these bodies here of prostitutes who died trying to get out of the Yoshiwara licensed prostitution quarter, that it's never a neutral act to look at dead bodies. And one of the things that the earthquake brought to the fore was the central tensions of the modern period, anxiety over modernity's relentless path of destruction. It wasn't just the sexual liberation of women, but this kind of invasive cosmopolitanism and all of the things that were represented by skyscrapers like this 12 stories here. This was one of the most famous skyscrapers that was destroyed in the earthquake, and you see it before and after. And these images of ruins, these iconic famous sites like the Asakusa skyscraper, became symbolic of the idea of the possibility of the reversal of progress. I'll just conclude with a few images of the earthquake memorial here, because it's important to know that earthquakes, one of the defining features of disaster and imagery is its codification through remembrance. And that begins almost immediately after the event takes place, and it's codified and over time. And the reconstruction process was actually capped by the building of two different types of reconstruction structures. The Earthquake Memorial Hall that you see on the left, which is a steel reinforced concrete building made to look like a Buddhist temple, and another building on the right, which was the Commemorative Museum. This building was designed by the famous architect Ito Chuta. And it's not only a Buddhist memorial hall where yearly annual Buddhist remembrances take place, but it's actually an ossuary or a martyrium or a reliquarium. It actually holds the bones, the cremated bones of many of the victims, which was unprecedented at the time. So this becomes a public memorial to their death. And then the Reconstruction Museum became a kind of public documentary housing all of these wounded objects like we saw before, bicycles, burned bottles, as well as statistical information about the earthquake and its reconstruction. And eventually this really was a monument to the city's reconstruction rather than to the death and the loss here. And it really houses and it evokes the bodily and agonistic associations, but it folds them into the memory and the successful reconstruction. And I'll just conclude with a comparison here today. We started talking about my colleague, Michael Lucan, who has done a lot of work on thinking about the ways in which these disaster images tie into images of World War II, particularly the fire bombings of Tokyo and, of course, the atomic bombings. And I show you some parallel imagery here, whether it's plumes of smoke, burned wastelands, evocative ruins, charred human remains, venerable debris, arrested clocks at the moment of destruction. This very powerful visual lexicon had an afterlife, a very enduring afterlife in the post-war period. And again, we're seeing it revived again in 2011. And an odd twist of fate, the Earthquake Memorial became the place in which the Tokyo air raid victims and also the story of that destruction during World War II was actually housed. So you have this uneasy man-made natural disaster overlap in this particular structure here. And so I thank you for your attention and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Donc je pense que ce qui a été très important de voir, c'est comment cette masse d'images qui s'est créée autour de des catastrophes naturelles façonne aussi notre façon de voir. Donc ce n'est pas des images illustratives qui sont là, détachées, mais en fait, il commence à former un corpus qui aussi porte des valeurs affectives. Donc je pense que c'est très important de montrer à travers tous ces médiums, tout type d'images commerciales aussi bien qu'artistiques, etc., que ces images travaillent. Ils créent une sorte d'affect qui s'associe avec des mémoires collectives, etc. Donc c'est vraiment une culture visuelle extrêmement riche, complexe, et qui continue à se proliférer et où il y a beaucoup de repères aussi encore aujourd'hui. Donc, thank you so much for doing this. I can take questions. Donc, je peux prendre des questions. On a à peu près 5 minutes. Oui?
Je parle en anglais. Je parle en anglais. I wanted to know if I came a little bit late, but I was wondering if this has any rapport with the festival in Nara of fire on the 12th of March. It reminded me of different images that for this festival that's Buddhist, that where you have to carry the fire. I don't know very much about it, but I did see some images of this, and I saw the resemblance with what you've showed us today. I don't know if there's any connection, but if there is, I'd love to know.
I'm not sure. Maybe you're thinking of the Daimongi Festival, where they light the hillside.
That's right.
The dye.
That's right, because there was a lot of images connected to that festival that have to do with catastrophe and fire and so forth.
Yes. I don't know as much about that specific festival, but I do know that there's not a strict delineation between what we think of as these historic catastrophes and disasters and the kind of cyclical disasters. They call them the seven catastrophes, which include plague and famine and all kinds of things in the Buddhist cosmology that was articulated back in the 13th century. There was a very strong, almost apotropaic Buddhist cosmology that developed around these ideas of various kinds of devastations and destructions, and they ranged from man-made war to natural disasters, and so just Japan has a whole slew of different ways in which that fear and that peril, threat from the unknown, is mitigated through human action, whether it's to try to ward off things, throwing, oni out, devils out, and various kinds of activities that you do throughout the year to just kind of rid yourself of potentially bad elements that will imperil the community, and purifications, and there's lots of purification rituals. And so, yes, I mean, it's a long answer to say, I do believe that all of those things are connected because they're part of one cosmology. And we, sometimes in a Western epistemology, we think of disasters as aberrations, things that rupture. They do rupture, but they're also part of the fabric of destruction and construction. And if you think of them as generative and you think of them as part of the kind of zeitgeist of a particular place and a particular people, then you can understand how they function in a more cyclical and more generative kind of way. So I think that's one great example, and there are many of them. Thank you.
On peut encore prendre une question. Oui.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. I just wanted to know a bit more about the architecture you showed by the Marvel group, I was really interested if they developed more permanent structures and architectures with the same shape. They're quite striking and expressive and more or less linked with a kind of creation destruction. If you could say some.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate your noticing that, because I do think they are incredibly interesting. And there's something about this very short window of the barracks and the time period, because they were basically erected for sometimes just several months until permanent reconstruction could take place. And so they afforded a kind of experimental intervention that really jived well with Mavo and their kind of sensibility. In fact, I do write about this quite extensively, about how, as much as the Mavo artists were shocked, and of course later on, after they know about the horrific murders and the devastation of their leftist colleagues, they're really deeply traumatized by the earthquake, but they're also kind of elated and euphoric over the possibilities of what they think might be a tabula rasa, or a new kind of landscape to build in. And then for those couple of months, they're trying to show the relevance of art, how art can be truly an art of daily life, and be part of this new rebuilding cityscape. But it turns out to be quite temporary. And we do find that overarching kind of hegemonic forces tend to take over. But there were some very interesting longer standing buildings, ones for businesses. Shiseido, the cosmetics company, for instance, had a longer standing barrack that they used for their headquarters for over a year or two. And that was also quite interesting. And there's a lot of people, Yoshida Kenkichi and Kon Wajiro, who were very active in documenting the modern experience and the earthquake, were also engaged in barrack decoration. And so barrack decoration was this kind of efflorescence of the possibilities in this breach, but it goes away. And they try, but it's not of the moment after the reconstruction of the city starts. It's really of that temporary moment. But it does show you that disaster can be an inspiration for creativity and produce a lot of possibilities for those people who are not able to make interventions in a more status quo.
Well, thank you. That's a hopeful message. So we have to start to end, because we need to air the room. We really need between sessions to have at least 10 minutes of air. So thank you again. Merci beaucoup à vous tous. Donc ceux qui veulent suivre la conférence suivante, il faut quand même quitter la salle pour aérer convenablement. Merci.